Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. My name is Cindy Bonnier, and I'm the President and CEO of the Fremont Chamber of Commerce, and we're pleased to have you here with us today. This is our first in a series of lessons in leadership, and normally we would be doing Leadership Fremont, but because of COVID, we have had to stop that until we can be in such a place that we can offer the same experience being together and things. So we thought in the meantime, there's a lot of professional development still to be done, a lot of lessons to be learned during the COVID. And we thought this was a great way to start sharing it with you. So we are so pleased to have with us our panelists, and we're going to get started very quickly. First, I want to, a couple housekeeping things. I really want to acknowledge Cargill Inc. for their sponsorship of this program and to make it possible for us to present this to you. And also the panelists will be taking questions at the end of the session as we get to the end. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat room and then we'll start dealing with those as we move forward. So with that, I want to welcome our panelists and Dr. Zettie Page, who is our moderator for the day. He is going to guide us through this conversation. We may experience some uncomfortable situations because of the topic, but hopefully we all walk away with a better understanding and a deeper learning experience here. So with that, I just want to say a couple words about Dr. Zettie Page. He is currently the CEO of the Bay Area Community Health Center, which was at one point in time, or it was called prior, the Tri-City Health Center in Fremont, and they have some other locations as well. He is responsible for securing millions of dollars in grants to improve clinics, to increase governance, revision and strategic plans, and implementing different kinds of record-keeping systems. He speaks fluent Mandarin. I didn't know that. Holds a doctorate of medicine in general medicine, is a doctorate in social work, and 3 master's degrees in social work. So just all around really smart guy who's going to lead us through this conversation. So with that, Dr. Page, I am going to turn it over to you. I am going to fade into the background until we are prepared to do audience questions, and I'll let you take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cindy. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really honored to be here to help moderate this very important and very timely conversation about not only leadership, but how we develop business culture of inclusion and unity. And a lot of words, a lot of conversation that we'll have to circle back on. And I'm going to encourage the panelists that we can tease through so that we can get responses in the chat and further build these conversations. We realize that the recent events that we've observed through the last year and a half, as well as the pandemic itself, it's actually put a brighter spotlight on many areas that we know need social change, and that movement is happening as we speak. I want to point to this first webinar because it's really designed to kind of stimulate a healthy dialogue with some of our community leaders, which hopefully will help us raise the awareness. So there may not be any hard, fast messages to take away in terms of answers, but we really want you to think and begin moving through from other perspectives of how we move forward. We think that these insights will help us learn more about equity in the workplace, and we're going to keep dialing back to that concept as leaders in the community to drive that. And then we want to make sure that there's a clarity in equity that is not synonymous with equality. And that's clear. That's clear that equity speaks about fairness and justice, and I think we have some key experiences in the panel that's going to talk about that. And equality is more about sameness and ensuring that everyone gets the same thing. And again, we're going to have our panelists to kind of enlighten us on those differences there. So I want to welcome our 3 panelists. I want to give you some quick background on the 3 of them. I read through and was just humbled at the experiences that are at this table now. Ken Maxi is the founder and president of the Urban League of Greater San Francisco Bay Area. He has over 20 years of experience in community relations, public policy, and economic development. He's a leader in consensus building, community organizing, and professional development. Ken is a participant in the American Council of Young Political Leaders, and he's traveled worldwide. He has been a delegate, an American delegate to Skopje, Macedonia. Did I get that right, Ken? Skopje, Macedonia.
Skopje, it's good. That's good.
Ken's also served as a political director for the former DNC chair, Howard Dean. In 2008, Ken was instrumental in the Obama for American campaign as the deputy director for Democratic National Convention in Denver, Colorado. He has many, many more accolades. He's a native of California, woohoo! And he was a graduate of Notre Dame de Namur in university, at the university, bachelor's degree in political science and history. He has an MPA at Howard, an MA International Peace and Conflict Resolution. Ken is well grounded to speak from several perspectives personally as well as the business arena. And my very own Chief Kimberly Peterson, let me bring her forward. Kimberly Peterson, she began her career with the Fremont Police Department in 1996 and was promoted to Chief of Police in 2018. Chief Peterson, with more than 20 years of experience, her career includes assignments from patrol to investigations. As an officer, she served as a Spanish translator, a field training officer, and a member of the bicycle team. During her time in investigation, she also worked with as a burglary detective, and later in the sexual assault detective area. Kimberly brings just an array of experiences and observations that will be value added in this conversation. As a patrol division commander, Chief Peterson had oversight of the day-to-day response calls for services by uniformed police and community service officers. She's got exposure in the traffic unit. She's worked with the K-9 unit and the communications unit. One of Chief Peterson's last major accomplishments as the patrol division commander was the implementation of our newly formed mental health evaluation team. Again, core perspectives that comes to the table that talks about equity in the workplace. In her role as Administrative Operations Division, she had the oversight of Animal Services and the Tri-City Animal Shelter, the detention facility, records, property, and evidence as well. She's a highly qualified trainer, and she's worked with the department's personnel unit. She's also served as a member of the City of Fremont's Smart Cities Committee. Once again, she brings a wealth of experience and observations and value added to how we can improve our business relationships and guide our communities to a higher way of inclusiveness and unity. And Jessica Aiden Lee, I'm not forgetting you. Ms. Lee grew up in New York City, actually in Queens, with limited speaking immigrant parents. She worked in blue collar arena. As first generation immigrant, Ms. Lee has helped her mother with her business at the age of 8 and has moved that forward. She was the first person in her family to attend college, and she graduated from Syracuse University with a bachelor's in political science and international relations. Ms. Lee also has an MPA degree from Cornell University. She's traveled worldwide, 30 countries and counting. And she's had just an array of just wonderful adventures, to include travels to Antarctica, boat cruising. She's worked in the United Nations in Sudan. She has over 15 years in the nonprofit sector of communities of color, focusing on ending gender-based violence, social justice, immigrant and refugee rights. Currently, Ms. Lee is with the Organization of Chinese Americans AAPI Advocate East Bay President. She is a social justice advocate. She is a certified diversity coach. Ms. Lee, thank you for being a part of this. I know that you previously served as the executive director of several nonprofits, to include San Francisco's Safe House and the Asian Pacific Islanders Domestic Violence Resource Project. You're currently working with International Rescue Committee and the United Nations, and you're running a consulting firm in Oakland. I want us to welcome these 3 highly qualified panelists, and let's get started with some questions and answer session to follow. And in full disclosure, there's a lot of information that's going to be included in these questions. We're going to tease it out, pick out what you'd like to focus on what you can bring to the table. And we're going to breathe. We're going to have more of a fire chat conversation. If there's something you think about as we move to another question, feel comfortable to share it. We'll bring it back. Cindy in the background is going to be pulling the questions in the chats as folks generate them, and we'll be able to come back and discuss them in a little more detail. So thank you. Let's get this moving with our first question. A lot of words. So what would you say that are common misconceptions when we talk about racism as it relates to inclusion? And I'd like to start with Ken.
Well, thanks for the questions, Zettie. You know, and I want to just thank everyone for the opportunity to say some words about this. Racism comes in all forms. I think traditionally, historically, we as a country have seen what racism does to a people. But unfortunately, our history is not taught the way it's supposed to be taught. So therefore, sometimes we forget that history. And as a result, including one another into the conversation about racism is never really accomplished. And I think there's some opportunities that we all, as Americans, as Bay Areans who claim that we are progressive and liberal and all those things, need to find it in our hearts to educate one another about others' cultures, religions, because there are opportunities for us to see the similarities as well as and celebrate the differences. But unfortunately, we don't do that enough. And I think it's the recent events of hate towards the AAPI community, and of course, the ongoing challenges that we see with certain law enforcement across the country, we have to find solutions to. And I think that only comes through education, and including education as a big part of that.
So Chief Peterson, in looking at these misconceptions and thinking about some of the points that Ken just made, you know, seeing the similarities and celebrating the differences, how do you see that relating to racism and the inclusiveness that we want to move towards?
Thank you, Dr. Page. Thank you for that question. You know, first of all, I do want to say that I don't pretend to be an expert on racism. I don't pretend to be an expert on, you know, such an incredible topic and such a timely topic as the one we're talking about today. But I do run a police organization, and police organizations are microcosms of, you know, the world at large. And what have we been dealing with here in America particularly during the year of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd? You know, this is something we all have to grapple with. We have to grapple with it as a police organization. We have to grapple with it in terms of our relationship with the community at large. We also have to grapple with it internally, you know, because a lot of the strife and a lot of the difficulty we saw last year, we were seeing within our own agency, you know, and I think that it really kind of opened our eyes as a leadership team within our organization that we have moved away. Back in when I first got hired here, we used to do 40 hours of courses on diversity training and inclusion. And we had moved away from that through the years. And, you know, I think falsely, with a false sense of comfort that, you know, we didn't need to do that anymore. And we recognized last year that we had to start having those conversations about races, those difficult conversations. It has to start at home, has to start internally. And so we began doing that last year. And that has been a real eye opener because it's not an easy conversation. Beyond the topic of racism, for me personally, I think it has a lot of similarities with just the topic of whether it's gender discrimination or bias or however you want to put it. And when I talk about myself personally, that's because I'm a woman in a field that is very male dominated to this day. And so there are a lot of conversations we're having here around the inclusion topic as well, expanding that not just from racism, but to women, to include other minorities, to include, I'm also happen to be a gay woman. So, there's that layer as well. So I'm probably already taking up too much time. I'll leave some time for Jessica, because I'll just get going on this. You won't be able to stop the train. So
yeah, Chief, I always love to talk to you about our social issues, particularly around Fremont. Thank you for that one. So Jessica, if we could bridge this, or your thoughts, with some of the things that we've just heard, in terms of the inclusion. Now, we've heard that history is missing some components depending on where you stand. You get a sense that we should be looking at our similarities and celebrating our differences. How do you see that in being able to understand racism, and then that next step with inclusion? We're going to take another stab at that and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I personally don't believe that inclusion itself is enough, right? So for a long time, we were talking about how do we diversify our organizations, right? And then we learned that diversity itself wasn't enough. And we're at this point and this pivotal moment in our organizations where it's not just about inclusion. Inclusion is the first step towards creating a culture of belonging, right? Towards creating psychological safety within our organizations so that people are able to bring their full selves into work without a threat to their social or status, well-being, or their career. And one of the things that I think that, and Ken mentioned this earlier, is that there is history that's missing. There's history where it was not by accident that certain histories are not taught in schools, right? It is essentially a way for white supremacy in this country to continue. And when you are able to really look back and study the history of different peoples in this country, we'll notice that all of our oppressions are tied. So, just as Black African Americans have been enslaved in this country, so has Asian Americans, so has Native Americans, so has the Latinx community, right? We've also all been lynched. We've also been victims of race riots, right? And so, by keeping our histories missing in curriculum that's taught to children, it keeps us staying divided and separated. And it really has been the narrative of this country that, we're all different and we should be divided. We should be pitted against each other, right? I think the other thing that's a misconception and in terms of thinking about racism is that it's been talked about as a Black-white issue for a long time, to the point where, Asian Americans are asking at this pivotal moment with API hate, like, are we actually people of color? Do we belong? Right? And so those are questions, those are conversations that's being had in our community. And I personally think that, working on anti-racism issues is actually just the first step, because, and maybe it's because I'm a first-generation immigrant and I work with a lot of immigrants, but the thing is, like, we have to, once we're, looking at anti-racism, we also have to look at anti-oppression. Because anti-racism is an issue that we're tackling right now in this country, but what does it look like elsewhere in the world, right? So like when I'm working with Asian groups, for example, it may not necessarily be a racism issue. It might be a colorism issue, right? It might be an ethnic oppression issue. And so sometimes working with those communities means that we have to meet people where they're at in order to help bring them along on this journey and this anti-racism work that we're all trying to do.
That's amazing. And there's several points there that circle back to the need for us to continue our understanding, to raise our awareness of not just the differences, which kind of stand out at times, but the similarities, and all of this in the context of our workforce and how we move our business culture. When we think about that and what Jessica just shared with us in terms of using the lenses from the other countries or lenses from outside of our scope, our business scope, how do we talk more about equity and the equality, and again, within our business culture? Do you believe that treating everyone, meaning your employees, obviously this flows into our community, but focusing in our business world, treating everyone the same would lead us to this equality that recognizes and celebrates and, you know, do some of the things we've just shared? Let's start with Jessica.
Yeah, so I would say no. I think it's about equity, because when we try, it's sort of like, okay, so I think about this like a pizza, right? And so you have a bunch of kids, you know, who are trying to have like share a pizza, but you have some kids who haven't eaten in days, and then you have a kid who just had their whole pizza to themselves an hour before they showed up, right? So dividing that pizza into equal slices doesn't necessarily make sense, because the kid who hasn't eaten in days is still going to be hungry, whereas a kid who's already full is still going to be full, right? And so we have to look at this beyond equality. And as businesses, we can't treat everyone the same, because everyone is different. And so when I'm advising companies and organizations on things around, you know, human resources, we look at, you know, even something as simple as leave, right? So for example, when we saw all of the racial trauma and issues that came up last year with the Black community, there were some companies that gave their employees days off, right? But it was open to all employees. Now, does that make sense? I don't know, right? I don't think so. I think that there are certain benefits and supports that we give to certain members of our employees, depending on what they're going through, right? Depending on the oppression that they face, the trauma that they're dealing with, right? So I do think it is very much looking at it from more of an individual perspective and an equity perspective than just having the same rules apply for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would agree with Jessica if I could just add a little something to that. I have a long background in coaching. I played soccer for my whole life and have coached my whole life. And, you know, I try and tell my new supervisors that while there may be some basic rules or guidelines that are same for everybody. For example, you know, we expect everybody to, you know, treat people with consideration, inclusion, with respect, both inside the building and outside the building. Obviously, something like that goes across the board. But, you know, when you're a coach, you want to play people in a position that will make them be successful and help the team be successful, at the same time that you're helping develop them in the areas where maybe they need some growth. So, I'm not talking about gender, racism, bias, any of that right now. I'm just talking about people in general. That, you know, if you have somebody, to put it in a football term, because, you know, a lot of people are football fans. You're not going to play your linebacker. You know, you're not going to play your lineman, let's say, who's going to be really big, really strong, but maybe not as mobile. You're not going to play your lineman as a wide receiver. That person wouldn't be successful individually, and it's not going to make your team successful. Same thing, you're not going to, you know, play your quarterback as lineman, right? You put people in the right positions for success, but you train them and you offer them mentoring and skills individually to help them in their growth areas. Now, bringing that into, let's just talk about the world of bias maybe, and I'll use gender again, because it's personally something I'm more familiar with. You know, we want to make sure that our people are being careful to make sure that we're mentoring our women and giving them that extra hand up, encouraging them. We know that women tend to wait a lot longer to put in for assignments, because as a gender difference, they tend to think, well, I'm not ready. Whereas as a gender difference, men tend to think, yeah, I'm ready to go. They tend to have more confidence in themselves. And when they fail, men tend to say, well, there's external reasons why I failed, whereas women tend to internalize that. So, you know, we put some effort into making sure we're creating mentorship opportunities for the women and nudging them to at least be willing to put in for supervisory positions earlier. We also, you know, pay for them to belong to associations that are women's associations, to make sure they have larger support, because we're only about 10% in this particular community. And I would, we also have in our organization, 2 of our police captains are Black. They take extra time to make sure that they're mentoring the next generation of Black police officers. and to ensure that they're encouraging them and getting them focused in the right direction so that they can grow through the organization as well.
I see. So again, you've added some more insightfulness in the indicators that we need to be paying attention to, and including as we move forward in developing our staff, developing our teams, and the approach to how we ensure their success or move towards success. But with that in mind, Ken, how do we do that in an inclusive way in our organizations? You know, what would that look like? What will the inclusion of these components that Chief Peterson is talking about look like in our business arena?
Thanks, Dr. Page. And I just want to echo both, Chief Peterson and Jessica's statements in this case, where not everybody is born into equal playing field. And we have to meet people where they are, and give them the opportunity to either learn and or give them the opportunity to play in that sandbox. Unfortunately, too many times, there is an argument that is made that, well, if I went to X school and another person went to Y school, well, if I had a, and I'll just take, for example, Fremont has one of the best school districts, I think, in the state of California. If a student from the best performing area of Fremont versus the, say, the least, and this one student was AP, and had the opportunity to have, a 4.6 GPA, and someone had maybe a 3.8 from the least performing school. So that student that maybe didn't have the same growing up experience and maybe had a different educational background, not have that same opportunity to go to a four-year institution. We have to consider these factors. And it's no different for jobs and for the marketplace that we're in here in the Bay Area. One of the most expensive places to live, if not just in the country, the world. And unfortunately, people of color, and yes, Jessica, you are, and Asian Americans are people of color, but in general, speaking to the Black and brown in particular, and then some of our Southeast Asian sisters and brothers, they are being priced out of the Bay Area and having to work 2 to 3 hours of driving, which causes a lot of things like mental health issues. It causes all these other, it's a trickle down effect where inclusion, we want to include individuals into this conversation, but sometimes it becomes a point of misunderstanding of what we're trying to accomplish here. Are we trying to include everyone by just saying, oh, we have a Black person, we have a Latino person? No. We want to make sure that the playing field, the opportunities that folks feel that they can actually be part of that location, live and work. Many of Silicon Valley does not have African-American and Latino community leaders that can actually live in the areas that they work. So, how do we build places, satellite offices, so they can also spend time with their families and say that their work living balances? That's inclusion to me as well.
Well, Ken, you bring out several points that you've built on, and I like the way you mentioned about the level playing field and how these factors really have to be racked and stacked in such a way, at least for the leaders in our business community. One of the things that I think ties into what Chief Peterson also has mentioned is the inclusiveness. But what I'm not hearing, and I want to bridge to the next question, is the cost to the individual and the business as well. And we've seen portions of this in response to hate crimes and, some of the marches over this last year and having to board up different, communities, or even COVID, where you have to shut down and shift how you provide your business to the community and who pays for that and so forth. So we know that inherent in how we do things, and history tells us that piece, there is a cost. So with this notion that the individuals and or the business is going to have to pay a price, how then, or what comes first? What must occur first to reach inclusion, to reach equality within our business culture? What are some of the things that we need to be mindful of? And Jessica, can you take a shot at that?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things, right? So I think as individuals, we have to be honest with ourselves in terms of where we are. We have to be self-aware of what we do know and what we don't know, and how much of it that we don't necessarily know. We have to realize that, yes, there is a cost to what as you mentioned, Dr. Page, right? But of not doing this work and of doing this work. I mean, the cost of not doing this work, if we're businesses and we're thinking about hiring, what I can tell you right now is that millennials and Gen Z are looking at the culture of businesses more than ever before. And they're asking questions in interviews like, how are you all normalizing conversations about race? They're looking at not just, getting a job, getting a paycheck, but they're looking at, websites like, is your company actually diverse? If I'm Asian American, and I am Asian American, right? Like, I'm looking at your website and it doesn't have any person of color. Do I actually want to come in and be that token? Do I want to be that person that is going to be the first person and have to hold all of that emotional burden, a psychological burden of trying to teach you all like what it means to be inclusive? I mean, I think we have to really be honest with where we are at and what steps we're going to take, right? And how much we're willing to change in order to take those steps. So like one company that I'm working with right now that's trying to build an inclusive culture, and they're primarily all white, mostly male culture, is looking at federal holidays. And typically businesses have the same federal holidays off that the federal government gives, right? But does that actually make sense? Do we want to as a company, do they want to celebrate Thanksgiving when for some Native American communities, it's a day of mourning, right? Do they want to call Christmas Christmas when looking at it, it's a religious holiday and they don't offer other religious holidays, right? So I think that those are things that we have to think about making changes to if we're going to be looking at building inclusion. And then also, like, to Chief Peterson's point earlier, it's like, what are the biases that we hold? One of the subtle biases that exist right now is when we're hiring. I mean, Black African Americans with Black African American names on resumes are least likely to get a job interview, right? Or if you're looking at, what schools they went to, what degrees, how many years of, that's all the things that we were taught, right? As managers, as executives to look at, right? But how much do we actually value lived experience? I mean, my work growing up, helping my mom run her business for 15 years doesn't get put on a resume because we're not taught to put that on a resume, right? And it wasn't actually until I was an adult that I realized that was actually job experience. So those are just a couple of things to really be thinking about when we're talking about inclusion and building that culture within our businesses.
Chief Peterson, you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I just, I think that Jessica's so right in that, in terms of just acknowledging that it exists. That has to be step one, right? Like every other issue we have to deal with. If we don't acknowledge that it's there, then how are we going to improve upon it? And, I think many of us, we see it as somebody else's problem. Racism is somebody else's problem because we see it as something that requires intention. So so we may only see, actual racist groups like Ku Klux Klan. Well, they're racist. I'm not racist. Not recognizing that racism can happen because of inattention. Because of not paying attention to our language, or to Jessica's points, what holidays do we celebrate? You talked about, Jessica, about names on resumes. And that's something that we actually changed a few years ago. Obviously in police work, we're going to have a whole different background. We have to be very careful about our background processes. And we saw a real difference, same thing, when we decided, why do we have names on there? Both for race purposes, but also for male female, because we felt like maybe we were being a little bit harder on one gender versus another. So we took the names off, and we did see an actual increase in diverse people, both in terms of color of the skin, but also in terms of gender. So that was, that was an eye opener for us.
Mm-hmm.
So to do exactly what you said, Jessica, we made it completely blind in terms of the name, and we kept the pronouns out of the documents, and that we saw a real increase in diversity kind of across the board.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So changing what we see, how we see and how we say, basically naming it, acknowledging it and naming it, it gives us more commonality to address the other issues. And I love the way you frame that in terms of that being one of our first steps. But what would be the next few things that we should consider in terms of how we embrace inclusion within the workplace? Ken, what would you see some of the best ways to take those next steps after it's being named?
After it's being named, I think and we're still in a pandemic, but I would say what we've learned is that we need to meet people where they want to be met. And for that may mean that if I'm a new parent, be it father or mother, that, maybe they're able to work at home for 2 to 3 days out of a week, right? Maybe that they don't have to commute as far. Maybe there's a satellite office. Inclusion to me has to be met with intentionality, as the chief has mentioned that she's done with her department. And I think from a corporate perspective, there has to be a commitment to ensuring that every employee feels that there is an effort made toward ensuring that intentionality is met. And what that is for each company might be different, but I think every employee and those future employees want to see that company X, Y, and Z are committed to at least in their intentional effort to make a difference around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Very good points. Very good points.
If I could just add one quick thing.
Please
I mean, this isn't going to surprise anybody who's interested in this webinar, but people got to see, they got to see themselves in those positions of power. People have to see, people need to see women, people need to see Asian American men, people need to see Black women in these positions of authority, so that, or just in the job. If this is a job that they want to be in, they need to see themselves in that job. So it's important that we think of that as we're hiring and promote and doing promotions.
That's an excellent point, and that does bring strength, and it brings a different flavor to conversations by empowering people to ask those questions, like, how long did it take you to get there? Or as Jessica mentioned, of all the countries you've covered, what value does that bring? What does your life experience bring to this? So being able to see yourself in that and then add the flavor. Ken mentioned that being intentional, maybe there's a difference that fits the different organizations, but by having the staff be able to see themselves and to reflect that and to help translate that, I think it really does enlighten how we move forward and how we come up with plans that are tailored to our organizations. Jessica made a point a little bit earlier when she mentioned increasing awareness. She mentioned something about the current generation and how they kind of do things a little different. Of course, I'm paraphrasing it, but they seem to have an increased access to current information, which really, if you think about it, that compares so differently to many of us who came into the workforce looking at history. We just had what was in the books. We just had what we had learned, through the school system. But this generation has ready real-time information about the agency that they're coming into, about the job, about the people in the job. And that's a different shift. And when you think about that, the blending, not just the demographics, but this ready access, that the new generation seem to come with. What are some conversations that you think need to happen with regards to inclusion or bringing them into the business world? What are some things you think we need to be talking about with this group of employees? Let's, Jessica, why don't you carry us with that?
Did you want to say something first, Ken? And I saw you guys.
No, go ahead.
You know, I think that I think that you have a generation, I see it more with the who are just really frustrated, you know, coming off of like the politics, coming off with like, I mean, we all know that there was a mass shooting in San Jose today, right? They're just done with like how previous generations have handled things around climate change. And I mean, right, because they've been marching. And I think that the conversations really need to be at a place where we bring them to the table, right? So you have like intergenerational dialogue about inclusion. We have them, I think there's also conversations around language, I think that needs to happen because they're using different words. And it's one of the things that I always have to talk to people about, like, because, you know, we have young people asking like, well, why can't they just tell us what their pronouns are, right? And it's like, well, some people didn't grow up knowing that there were many, many different pronouns, right? So I think there are conversations like that need to be had. And I also think that it's a conversation around like sharing expertise, sharing ways that things have been done before, because I see a lot of anger in terms of like, why are we still in this right now, right? And I do think that there are things that we have learned from the civil rights movement, right? That we can teach and impart that wisdom onto younger people who are now building their own movements, largely, you know, that are happening on the internet.
So that sounds like there is value in at least lessons learned in our histories, obviously as our organizations, but also on a broader scale, and how we use that to make our changes or to build on some of this rapidly accessible new information. But when we're bridging the past and the new within the business world, you know, it's a daunting task. I'm going to personally share that. I see it and feel it every day. Nevertheless, we do have to press that forward, and we have to talk about bringing everybody in that are employed, that are part of us, that wear our name, that, you know, carry that brand. But when we address the equality within the workforce, there seems to be some awkwardness. There's an uncomfortableness that we hear our colleagues talk about and share. How do we move through that? What are some things that you could share, Chief Peterson, about how we would address that within the workplace when we know it's uncomfortable? And I'm asking you, just so everybody hear that, you've talked about the mentoring and the trainings and the teachings, and I know you've got a handle on that.
Well, I believe me, I don't profess to have solved the issue, but it starts with having those conversations. So we have started a series of cultural diversity and implicit bias training. I mean, they're all, you know, very much interrelated, but so we've begun a whole training series that we have all of our employees attend, starting with the implicit bias, acknowledging that we all have biases and taking them through what's implicit versus explicit bias. We followed that with a wonderful training by a captain from another agency who, that one in particular was around the Black experience and in terms of race relations between the Black community and policing. That is not a comfortable conversation for our folks, but you have to engage in it. You have to be willing to engage in it. And so, you know, the good news is at the beginning of the call, there's a lot of, you know, in the time of COVID, we're in Zoom trainings, but there's a lot of this. But by the end, you're starting to draw out conversations. Now, again, don't pretend that we've, you know, completely overcome racism in our organization. You know, this is going to be an ongoing bit of work for all of us. Mm-hmm. And will we eventually reach, you know, equality? Will we eventually reach 100% inclusion? I don't think that'll happen in my lifetime, but just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't, undertake the task. But it does start by normalizing that conversation and engaging in it and asking people to have those uncomfortable discussions.
Mm-hmm. One last comment on that, Ken. I'm going to you for that too. And what will we see, listening to what Chief Peterson just shared, if we don't reach it? What are some of the things we want to see that will tell us we're moving towards equality, we're improving that component?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think that should be noted, that should be looked at as a pathway to success, is cities as well as counties are doing something that some corporations have been doing for at least a couple decades, which is chief diversity officers. They're creating these employee resource groups. So the conversations are had a lot more often, and they are more intentional. Look, we're still trying to fit this perfect union process into our minds and understand what that looks like from a historical standpoint. So I think we're back on track. I think we're sidetracked for some years, but I think we're back onto that conversation of forming a more perfect union, and hopefully the intentionality of so many people here in the Bay Area and across our country are building a conversation that will have folks across all religious, all cultural lines to feel that this country is a place of opportunity, and for us to all be able to thrive one way or another.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. I greatly appreciate that. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to give some time. I didn't see Cindy's response just yet, but Cindy, can you give me some input in terms of questions or call-ins? I see one question, if I can jump in that. The influence of while we change the names and respond to identifiers of applicants, how do we respond to some of the hairstyles and body symbols? And I'm going to take that a step further. Sometimes we have applicants that may have colors in their hair that aren't homegrown, piercings and tattoos and so forth. That speaks to our younger generation and their identity and their self expression. Let's speak to what are the conversations? That's a safer way to respond. What are the conversations we want to include or have in engaging and including individuals that clearly are different from maybe our policies or our business practice? You see how I've slowed down and I'm dancing around that. Let's start with you, Jessica.
So, yeah, I liked how you danced around that, Dr. Page. So I'm a little radical. So I'm going to say the conversations would be, what are we hiring them for? To look good or to do the job? Mm-hmm. Right? Secondly, if we're a business and we're trying to appeal to customers in their generation, wouldn't we want the person who is representing them to look like someone who, I mean, that's part of it. It's like, yeah, I'm like trying to be politically correct, and it's not working very well.
And you're demonstrating exactly what we work with and how we have to have further conversations so that we use similar words and understand those words in our conversations of inclusion. So thank you. This is exactly core to why we're meeting and having this session right now.
That's a timely comment for us because, we are a very traditional culture, right? A very conservative culture in policing. We wear a uniform. The idea of a uniform is that everyone looks, if not exactly the same, at least similar. You're readily identifiable. So, you have the conversations happening now. We actually have a committee working on it. We're just starting with beards, but they'll move on to tattoos. We're starting with beards and hair because the Crown Act does require us to make sure we're making sure that we are allowing for natural hairstyles. So if somebody has really curly hair, like one of my sons has really curly Afro hair. My kids are half black. That we want to make sure that we allow them to wear their natural hairstyles. It is what it is. We don't want to discriminate against that hairstyle. But to Jessica's point, we want to hire this new generation who has a much more accepting look at, let's just use tattoos as the example. Now, here's the other side of the coin as an employer, especially in policing right now. Who's going to be the tattoo czar? Who's going to say that tattoo is appropriate versus that tattoo may have implications for our community that would make our community feel, mistrustful. So it can be complex, and again, I don't have all these answers, but we are having those conversations now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Some agencies are allowing full tattoos, full beard, full piercings. We're not quite there yet. We're moving toward it a little more incrementally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Ken, before I ask you to comment to that, we have one question that frames culture wars or avoiding that. From the business arena, we know that there are policies, there's legalities, in terms of human rights, personnel or labor rights and so forth. So all of that is what we bring, what intersects the nature of our businesses, private, non-profits, whatever they are, that intersects protections and making sure that people are following those policies and those protocols. What are some things we want to be mindful of, Ken, to avoid the culture wars? And let me give you a classic example. Oh, you wrote me up because and you can feel that right? Give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, Dr. Page, I think that is something I think so many are trying to grapple with. The culture wars of it's really generational. I would call it the generational renaissance in many ways that we're experiencing. And we need to figure out how to do that better. I think the Crown Act that was led by then Senator Holly Mitchell, who is now county supervisor in Los Angeles, was a perfect example of that paradigm shift. But we as nonprofits, businesses, leaders in general, have to, again, be intentional and meet this generation halfway at least, ensuring that they too can be an executive with 5 tattoos, but understanding that it may be something that they will have to either disguise or maybe, work with the company that they work with to ensure that they're doing it in the right way, because everyone should have an equal opportunity to become an executive in a nonprofit or company.
I like your point, and we're gonna carry that over in our next webinar about equal opportunity, because I think that's very loaded. Cindy, I got you. I see the timing on that, and I really, really want people to hear this is just the beginning of some ongoing conversations. Hopefully the chamber under Cindy's leadership will be able to help frame and drill into more depth of how we do this. I love the fact that collectively you talked about naming the experiences. I love the fact that you've talked about awareness and more understanding that's needed to take us through the intersection of culture and of policy and of programs and target the way we're doing business so that we can be productive and prosperous in our communities, not just in Fremont, but across our Bay Area. So Cindy, I'm going to turn this over to you. I want to acknowledge you and thank you for your leadership. Thank you that the Chamber of Commerce has been willing to be a platform to develop more of our business culture that speaks to inclusion and to unity. So with that, Cindy, it's yours.
Thank you, Dr. Page. Just before I say anything else, I know Chief Peterson has to step away very quickly for something that has come up. So before you leave, Chief, I just wanted to thank you again for your time. And whenever you need to drop off, please feel free to do that.
Absolutely. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I feel like, as Dr. Page says, I feel like we barely scratched the surface of this. I mean, we barely cracked the nut or whatever the right colloquialism is on this. And, you know, we talked about doing different topics on all these lessons in leadership webinars, but I think that this may require a follow-up. And I think there's essentially more things that we need to do. I actually had some of my own questions while I was going through this that because of timing, I think I'm gonna have to save for another time, but or our next session. But if our panelists are willing to come back, we'd love to have you. We'd love to do a follow-up session for this. So I will contact you afterwards, and we can see about maybe setting up a follow-up session for this. If you're all willing to do that, that would be great. But to end this, I just want to again thank Dr. Page for his leadership and guiding us through this conversation. I think you did a fabulous job. Thank you so much. And of course, Ken, for all your help and helping us connect with Jessica. And thank you, Jessica, for stepping in. As you did, you brought in some really interesting insights that we appreciate so much. So with that, I am going to again thank Cargill Salt for their sponsorship and helping us get this done, and wish you all a very great day, and hopefully we'll see you back again really soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Be safe, be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.